It is my honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Reverend Susan Yarbrough. Susan, a native Texan, attended Baylor and Rice University. She earned a Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from the University of Houston Law School. Susan practiced law in both state and federal courts before being appointed to a judgeship in the United States Immigration Court. She served 18 years on the bench, retiring in 2005. As a 7-year-old girl, Susan received her call to ministry. However, not until 60 years later did she respond to the call. A student of Meadville Lombard Theological School, she graduated in May of 2017. Susan's roots run deep in both Christian and Jewish traditions, re-examining traditional stories in light of female, people of color, and LGBTQ perspectives. I'll give you Susan Yarbrough.
Thank you, George. Both of our readings for today teach us about the blessings that come from having a servant's heart, which offers the gifts of unconditional welcome and radical hospitality to strangers. The first reading is from the 18th chapter of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible. As Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day, he looked up and saw three men standing nearby. Instead of waiting for them to approach, he rushed to meet them, bowed low, and declared that he was their servant, after which he offered them water, rest, and the best bread and milk from his own grain and herd. The men asked about Abraham's wife Sarah and told him that in spite of her old age, she would bear a child within a year. And this came to pass. The second reading is from the 25th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew in the Christian Bible. At the time when all the nations are gathered, the judge will turn to those on the right and say, "Come close to me and be blessed and happy. For when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was a stranger, you took me in. When I was naked, you gave me clothes. When I was sick, you took care of me. And when I was in prison, you visited me." Then the people to whom these words were spoken will say, "Why, when on earth did we do all of these things for you?" And the judge will say, "Whenever you did it for one of the least of these, all of whom are members of my family, you did it for me." Thank you all for being here, and thank you for letting me be here. When almost every one of us in this room was a child, one of the first rules our parents laid down and reminded us of often was, don't talk to strangers. That was and still is good advice for kids, especially given how much more dangerous the world is now than it was several decades ago. But that rule, like many of the ones we grew up with, ran counter to other things we were hearing and reading as children, and that created a lot of confusion, at least for me. For example, while we were hearing "don't talk to strangers," many of us were also reading Hebrew scriptures which say no less than 36 times, "You shall welcome the stranger. You shall welcome the stranger." The voice of the Hebrew verb is imperative. "You shall welcome the stranger, for you yourselves were once strangers in Egypt." Or we were noticing in the Christian scriptures that Jesus, the radical Jewish rabbi, was constantly welcoming and befriending and listening to strangers, such as prostitutes, lepers, and beggars. But the real problem with the "don't talk to strangers" rule is not the confusion it may have engendered in us as children. Instead, it's the fact that the rule still echoes unconsciously in many of our adult lives, and its remnants still have the capacity to limit our ability to offer deep listening and heartfelt hospitality to people who come to us from other places on the earth. And even more fundamentally, the Don't Talk to Strangers rule still wields enormous power when it comes to welcoming and listening to those parts of our inner selves from which we are estranged, and which keep us from the growth into wholeness that will enable us to set out the welcome mat and prepare the table for the increasing number of strangers who want and need our help and our embrace. 13 years ago this coming summer, I retired from 30 years in the legal profession. It was a great, great day. I spent the last 18 years of those years as a judge on the United States Immigration Court, and it was a job that altered the course of my emotional and spiritual life. When most of us think about immigration, and it's hard not to think about it these days, we primarily think about the dreamers or about undocumented workers who come here and do those hard jobs for low pay and lots of exploitation. But few of us think much about people who come here seeking asylum and refuge because they have been greatly harmed in body and spirit in their own countries. During my 18 years as a judge, I heard thousands of cases brought by people who had been tortured and persecuted in their countries, had made their way to this country, and were seeking asylum in court proceedings that one by one broke my heart, taught me the beginnings of what I need to learn about welcoming inner and outer strangers, and changed me forever as a judge and a person. Under American immigration law, a person qualifies for a grant of asylum if he or she or they can prove that they have been tortured or persecuted in their own country, or have a well-founded fear of such persecution if sent back to their country because of their race, their religion, their nationality, their membership in a particular social group, or their political opinion. The torture or persecution must have been inflicted by the government or a group that the government cannot control, and things such as domestic violence, random street crimes, and discrimination have traditionally not been grounds for obtaining asylum. Only one or more of the 5 grounds specified in the statute, race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion, is a proper predicate on which a judge may grant asylum. The asylum seekers whose cases came before me were all strangers to me, not only because I didn't know them, but also because I, like most other Americans, simply have no idea about what really goes on in troubled countries. And when we superimpose our lack of knowledge about politics and geopolitics and even just basic geography onto differences of language and dress and religion and experience, we start to realize how much we live in our personal and national hermetically sealed spacesuits, how much we labor under concepts of otherness that are often fed and fueled by the media, and how hard and how far we have to reach in order to give meaning to the concepts we mouth so readily, such as the brotherhood of man, or the web of life, or we are one, or even Unitarian Universalism. Besides its much-needed lessons of gratitude and humility, the primary blessing of my job was how it taught me to listen deeply to people who had been harmed and persecuted, to hear the subtext of their narratives, to see the scars on their bodies and the fault lines in their psyches and their souls, and to eventually welcome them into my heart and my country with an openness that I never thought was possible for me. But the process of learning to listen and welcome was a gradual one, and I received many lessons along the way. The most important thing I learned is that there are so many parts of myself from which I was and still am estranged. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung called this our shadow, those parts of our personality that we don't acknowledge because they don't fit our conscious identity or what we would like to think of ourselves. For example, when I heard the testimony of Esteban Marcial Mosqueda, a Cuban citizen who was sent to prison for 5 years simply for being unemployed and was tortured there because he was a negro azul, a man whose skin was so black that it appeared to be navy blue. My own inner stranger appeared with the shadows and said, "I'm not a racist, but why is it easier for me to remember the features of a lighter-skinned African American than the features of one who is very dark?" And when I heard the case of Josue Maldonado Ortiz, a Pentecostal Salvadoran who was accosted by a military death squad and forced to strip naked, stand in a field of beans and rice, and eat his pocket Bible page by page, my inner stranger showed up and asked, "Why do you secretly think that Pentecostals and members of other fundamentalist denominations are simple-minded?" Or when I heard the case of Khalid Talhami, a law-abiding Palestinian who was used as a human shield by Israeli soldiers when they wanted to roust and toss Palestinian neighborhoods, my inner stranger tugged at the sleeve of my judicial robe and said, "Now really, don't you think that this man is an exception and that the Arabs and Muslims are mostly responsible for all the trouble in the Middle East?" And when Elena Segura Jimenez testified about being gang raped and gang sodomized during the Nicaraguan Civil War by a band of Contras after they had followed her home and she had offered them water, my stranger said, "Why in the world would any woman talk to a group of men she didn't know?" And finally, when Daniel Quetzal Monzon, an indigenous Guatemalan Indian, recounted how he was captured by the military, which had murdered and disappeared so many of his own people, and was then tortured because he would not voice support for that government, my stranger kept asking, "God, why didn't he just tell them what they wanted to hear so they would leave him alone?" So in just 5 cases, I was confronted with my own shadowy inner strangers of color discrimination, intellectual arrogance, religious prejudice, blaming the victim, and cowardice. These stunning appearances by my inner strangers gave me great pause. And maybe this is a good point for each of us to take a conscious breath and ask, what is the name of one of my own inner strangers? How does it limit my growth into wholeness? And how can I befriend it and offer hospitality to it? If we think back over our lives with honesty, we know that we have all been strangers in some kind of personal Egypt, and that each of us at some time in our life has had our face pressed up against the glass of something we yearned for with an aching and a longing that simply defied words. That sense of longing is part of what keeps us alive, and if we treat it with compassion instead of judgment, it becomes the lexicon by which we can translate our memories of pain and alienation and our desire to be received and included into the ability to welcome others. As Irish Catholic scholar and poet John O'Donoghue has noted, when we don't have hospitality to ourselves and our longings, there is no longer any presence or welcome for the surprise and wonder of new things and new people. I believe so strongly that when we choose to welcome and love and accept those inner parts of ourselves which repel us, we will then become most able to welcome those who are not from us, but who are most assuredly of us. To provide those outer strangers with the dignity and sanctuary of human presence, and to feel a joyous impulse to welcome and care for the wider world much as our right hand would not hesitate to bandage our left. And to our own surprise and delight, we will surely find ourselves greeting and blessing all the strangers in words something like these. Ni hao, hello. Bienvenidos a los Estados Unidos, su casa nueva. Welcome to the United States, your new home. Namaste. My soul recognizes and bows to your soul. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. May we bind up your wounds. May you be happy. May you always be safe from harm. May you set your tents among us. May you teach us what we need to know about our own alienation and attachments and longings. May we catch your melodies and harmonies as you learn to sing God's song in this strange land. May you know that you are seen and heard and remembered. May we build for you a house of belonging. And may we bless you as you and your coming here have blessed us. Amen. Thank you for everyone who made this possible today. Musicians, hospitality, all of that. It's been a joy being here with you. And now we extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we hold in our hearts until we are together again. And now may the grace of the Spirit continue to dwell in this warm and welcoming congregation. May each one of us learn to welcome our own inner strangers so that we may love ourselves completely and then better love our neighbors as ourselves. And in Hebrew we say, Navarech Erein HaChayim, let us bless the source of life, whose flame kindles our commitment to search for ever more ways of living our freedom and sharing our love. Amen.